so I'm back for the next little while. This is the last night of the Wolf Talisman, and after that I will be taking a hiatus, probably until the end of the month, just because I need to get caught up on things. I'll let you know if I come back sooner. If I do, it'll probably be short stories, but I really like doing this. It's kind of a habit now, and I feel weird when I don't. But I also have a bunch of projects I have to get caught up on, and I also need to pick out what the next story is going to be. So there's that as well. But for those of you just joining in, what I'm doing is I'm reading my dad's manuscripts. Oh my gosh, words. Anyway, and as I'm going, I am marking them up for editing. I have not actually read the story through first, so I'm just as surprised as you with whatever comes out. And then from there, yeah. So tonight I'm reading another group of chapters. I've been trying to power through them all because I'm going to be going away. But tonight I will start off with chapter 27. At the city of Imcro, with the rebel army. They haven't tried to burn the city, commented Wallen. I'd expected them to destroy it so we can't have the use of it. Dalwyn smiled a little bleakly. I don't suppose they could. With the number of troops they have, the last thing they want is the city rising against them, and that would have happened if they started setting fires in the city. He glanced back over his shoulder. The army was coming up behind him. They were still buoyed up by the victory over the Atascans at the river, but he knew very well that was not a certain test. If they met the Imperial army in an open field, with no time for traps or tricks, they might not fare so well. Their advantage, that he'd led them to one victory, meant that they'd be at least a little more inclined to heed his orders. At the same time, having beaten the almost unbeatable Imperials, they might well take it into their heads that now they were unbeatable. Are they actually going to fight? Asked Wallen. Look there! Up ahead, about 300 men, armed and armored in the Atascan fashion, were marching toward them. It must be some kind of trick, Dalwyn said. They couldn't think to be even delaying us with a force that size. Send up some scouts. Yes, Lord. Orders were passed, and a small band of horsemen went galloping out. A moment later, one of the men around the commander of the Atascan force held aloft a reversed spear shaft with a green branch tied to it. They're offering a truce, Dalwyn said. Some kind of sneaky trick, I'd bet, Wallen muttered. Don't worry, I won't walk into anything, Dalwyn assured him. Very shortly the scouts came back, escorting a small party of Atascans. As they came nearer, it was clear they weren't Atascans at all. It's those traitor bastards that signed up with the Imperials. Let's put an end to them all, Lord. Let's just wait what they have to say, Wallen. You know we're going to be fighting Haladanians soon enough, when Otalto joins with Dalam. Wallen muttered something, which Dalwyn took care not to hear. As the small band came even nearer, he was able to recognize the face of the commander. A good day to you, Dalwyn, not Hargadal. What now? You chose your paymaster. Why don't you go with him? The other's mouth tightened. I suppose you'd see it that way. I explained it to you that day, did I not? That at least this way we were promised something other than a life of starvation and want. Now here we are again, because they've taken the promise away. They gave our word to them, Lord, and we would have fought, and even fought against you. But they chose to distrust us. They sent word for all of us to come in and turn in our arms. Once we'd done that, we'd have nothing, not even our pride. So we took We took our arms and our equipment and left before they could find us. We see the choice before us. Either to convince you to let us join you, or to become bandits in the land until someone hunts us down to kill us like wolves. Dalwin thought quickly. There were a number of advantages and disadvantages to accepting Dalwin's offer. But the man was waiting for him to speak. And if I were to accept your offer, Dalwin, how would it go? Would you follow my orders without question, or would you suddenly decide to take umbrage against something I had asked you to do and desert me? Lord! Wallen protested. Would you even consider for a moment employing these? They betrayed you one time, and they won't betray you again? Dolan Nat Hargattle looked at Wallen. It was clear that he would prefer to draw his sword and challenge the man who was impugning his honor, but at the moment he had to consider more than himself. He turned back to the Count. Lord, your man has a good deal of justification for speaking as he does, and I will not bother you with a long speech in protest, declaring just what fine fellows we are. I will only say this. If you keep faith with us, we will keep faith with you, even to the death. Lord, said Wallen in a warning voice, is this not just what Italto would do? Send someone to join us with a fine story, only to turn on us at the last moment? He looked at his old comrade. I see another thing here that is typical of Italto, to suddenly put aside a servant out of fear for what that servant might do. And what do you think 300 or so men are likely to do in this army we have behind us? No, if Italto were to send people out to join us for the purpose of causing us harm, it would be more likely to be a mere handful, 10 or 20, who would bide their time. But already you watch who approaches me, and allow no stranger to come too close, making the task of any assassin nearly impossible. He turned back to Dalwin. On the other hand, you can understand that I trust you only so far, until you have proven yourselves. But I think there will be considerable work for you to do, if you are satisfied with that. Lord, give us a task to do, and we will see how we perform it. For the moment, we must find you a place in our line of march. He looked at the group of men around him and picked out one. Forat int Alowan. Put them in a place, not at the very end, but near to it. And Dalwin, you will know that there are many among us who feel as my friend Wallen does. You and yours will have to accept a good deal of talk, and do it without responding. I can put you and your men to use, but if I have to be breaking up fights between your men and mine, your usefulness will be very limited. Dalwin nodded briefly. We accept a good deal, Lord, and we accept your terms. Will you require an oath of us? He shook his head. If a man is going to be faithful, he will be faithful. If he's going to be unfaithful, no number of promises will make a difference. As they set out again, Dalwin noticed that Wallen was very quiet. It's more than a whim, my friend. I have an idea how Dalwin and his men can be very useful to us. There are some things I have to work out, but when I've thought it out, I will explain it to you. All I can say is, they came to you, they sought refuge with you, then they betray you. Now they turn against Italto as well. I don't like it, Lord, and I don't think I'll ever like it. As for their betrayal of me, Wallen, consider their situation. They had little enough status so long as I was Count. Then they saw my status as Count was in decline, that slowly and surely Italto was imposing the Tuscan laws and customs. Their protection and their little status was disappearing. They saw it as an opportunity to save themselves. I won't say I was greatly cheered by it, but I could certainly understand it. Wallen remained silent. That day, the Count of Imcro took possession of his ancestral city, and that evening he held court in his own hall. He had won a victory in the field, and had driven the Tuscans out of the county of Imcro, which gave him some status among his chiefs. He knew the old stories, about how chiefs had gathered large armies to attack the empire on the strength of less. The stories, practically without exception, told how the chief in question led his force to one battle too many, and a lot of them were destroyed. On occasion, he had a feeling that he was different, that he could outdo any of those people in the legends. Then, the sobering thought would come to him that, without a doubt, all those old chiefs felt the same. It was in one of those moments, after most of the feasting was done, and some harper had just finished singing a song telling how Dalwyn the Mighty had overthrown the Atascans, practically single-handed, that Wallen leaned over and spoke. "Lord, you look somewhat grim for a man whose triumph is being so celebrated." "Perhaps I do. I've been thinking what our next move will have to be. I would much prefer to let things be as they are, and let Atalto go wherever he will." "Lord, you know they won't let you do that." He shook his head. "Unfortunately, you're right. In Atalto's case, I suspect he's already sent messengers to the Empire, demanding more troops. And as for the High King, knowing what he tried to do to me, how can he let me be? He will know in his heart that I must be plotting some kind of revenge against him, and he will bring all his warriors down to conquer me as soon as he can. And we don't have the forces to defeat him when he has his troops gathered, so we're going to have to do as we did with the Atascans here. We're going to have to go up and force them to fight before they're ready, and win. If we've won one victory, he may find some of his chieftains a little less than willing to come out to fight for him." Wallen nodded. "Perhaps we should send word that we're coming. There are no few up there who would be willing to oppose Dalwyn if they think they have a chance of succeeding. And now you have something of a reputation." "Yes, do that. Any help we can get, we'll be happy to take." After dinner, Dalwyn went looking for Halisi. He had brought her and her maid along because there was still some hostility toward her on account of her father. There was too much of a possibility that some fool would decide to do away with her, no matter what Dalwyn said, and it was slightly easier to keep that from happening if she was with him. She smiled when she saw him. "Are your quarters adequate?" He sounded stuffy and pompous in his own... Sorry, how about I do this properly? "Are your quarters adequate?" He sounded stuffy and pompous in his own ears, but she smiled. "Yes, quite comfortable, particularly if you remember that I spent my last few weeks out camping out with the army." "I'm sorry about that. It's just that..." "I know it's just that you're trying to keep me safe, and I appreciate that. I do. I know what some of your people thought of me and still think of me, and I don't see what I could do to prove them wrong either. So I'm happy for your protection. Will you come in for a moment?" "Do you really think I should?" She smiled a wry smile. "If it's my reputation you're thinking about, I doubt you can do it much damage anymore. And if it's your own reputation that worries you, I think it would take more than a few minutes in my presence to ruin that. You're the new hero of Haldania, you know." "So I've been told." He stepped inside and closed the door. "I find myself being compared to any number of heroes of the old days, usually the ones who went up against the Empire and ended up by fighting one battle too many and getting themselves killed heroically along with most of their followers." "But you have done well." "Oh, I've done well enough, I suppose, and I can see I won't be allowed to stop yet. The High King won't let me, and he'll have support of a fair number of Atascan troops. My only hope is to move on him first, and hope to win a battle or two before he can get his whole force gathered." "Will you fight the Empire, then?" He shrugged. "If they leave me alone, I'd be very happy. One hopeful sign I've heard is that Tumulia has invaded the island of Salsha, which means that the Empire will have its hands fairly full for the next little while. I'd like to have enough time to arrange things so that they're no longer fighting the Tumulus. Haledania is just too difficult for them to attack. It depends on so many..." He sighed. "It depends on so many things." "You're trapped too. I understand better than you might think." He forced a smile back onto his face. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be forcing my woes onto you." "I don't think of it that way at all. My father never used to bother telling me about things he was doing. But on occasion, he would have people in for dinner, and I was required to be present. Another piece of his lovely furniture, you might say. I was not expected to take any part in the conversation, Indeed, that would be considered bad manners on my part. But after they'd talked enough, I could usually figure out the topic under discussion, as well as the general attitudes involved. So, I know about Celsha and the Tumulian Empire, and a number of things besides. When you talk to me as though I might actually know what you're talking about, rather than treating me as something beautiful, which you will eventually trade away in return for support of one of your plans, I rather enjoy it. He relaxed a little then and looked around the room. This room was not one of the better ones in this hall. Even I have to be sensitive to politics, you see. If I'd given you the best room, many of my people would begin worrying what kind of hold this Ataskan woman had over their count. And that would lead to even more concern as to whether or not I'd be really willing to drive the Imperials out and keep them out. Or whether this whole thing might just be a ploy for me to replace your father as an Imperial representative. She looked around herself, smiling. Never mind. It's a fairly comfortable room all the same, and I have no servants, but one maid, so I really don't need anything much larger. The bed is comfortable, and much more comfortable than mattresses on the ground in a tent. The talk went to houses and homes, to favorite places each of them knew, and though neither of them had ever seen the other places the other knew, each was able to describe enough to give the other idea of what the place was like. Suddenly the door was flung open, showing a band of armed men. Dalwyn's nervous state was such that he was on his feet with his sword in his hand before he was truly aware of what was happening. The men began to rush in, and the Count was up and fighting before the three of them could manage to enter. Even so, it looked as though the fight could only have one ultimate end, since there were so many of them. Halisi took up the heavy earthenware water pitcher from the stand by her bed and threw it in the face of the fourth man, who was stepping through the door. He staggered backward into the others. She jumped for the door and swung it closed just as they began to sort themselves out, and slammed the bar into place. It wouldn't keep them out forever, of course, but the noise they made in breaking it down would bring the guards, who ought to have been alerted already by the sound of clashing swords. It would seem that the assassins had counted on being able to do their work quickly and then escaping. As for Dalwyn, he was holding his own reasonably well. The three assassins who had managed to make their way inside had no armor, but leather, which is easily to move silently in. But Dalwyn was not even wearing that. He had behind him, however, long hours of training with the sword, which he made that count. He was also fighting 3 against 1, though by quick moving he managed to hold position so that he was fighting no more than 2 at a time. Alisi took the stand on which a water pitcher had been sitting, lifted it high, and then ran in and slammed it down on the head of one of the three. The stand was wooden and of very solid construction. The man's leather cap took some of the force of the blow, but his knees began to buckle. She raised the stand and brought it down once more, and the man went down on his face. One of his comrades suddenly noticed and turned, slashing backhand at her. She jumped back, dropping the stand, lost her balance and fell. But in that same moment, Dalwyn's sword caught him in the chest and sent him staggering. The other jumped forward, almost in a panic, seeing the odds going down so badly, so the Count had to parry his wild blows. Then he leapt for the door, grabbing at the bar, but before he could move it, Dalwyn jumped in and cut him down. A moment later, the wounded assassin began moving toward the Count, but the Count easily beat aside his thrust, burying his own sword deep in the man's chest. The assassins outside were pounding on the door, but even now the clash of swords could be heard as guards arrived. Dalwyn spoke to Halisi. Close and bar the door after me. He opened the door and stepped out into the melee. Halisi shut the door after him, trying to make some conclusion as to how the fight was going, based on the noise. A movement inside the room caught her attention. She noticed that the assassin she had hit with the wooden stand was on his hands and knees, groping for his sword and shaking his head. She picked up the stand once more and brought it down on his head with all the force she could muster. He collapsed and lay still. She looked around and considered making sure of him with one of the swords, but realized she didn't have enough strength in her arms to wield one properly. She sat down on the bed once more, with the stand close to hand, and watched him. Shortly thereafter, the noise of fighting died away outside, though there was still a good deal of shouting. Someone was demanding to know how the guards had been so blind as to allow such a group of armed men to make their way into the great hall, let alone come so far as to put the life of the Count in danger. Whoever answered did so in a low voice, low enough she couldn't make it out through the door what he might be saying. At that moment there was a gentle tap on the door. "Lady Halisi, you may open the door now. The situation is in hand." She opened it to see Count Dalwyn standing there. His short sword was sheathed, and he was using the tail of his cloak to staunch the flow of blood from a cut along his forearm. He looked around the room, noticing a changed position of one assassin, and his face reddened. "I apologize, lady. I went off running like a fool without making sure of him. Are you all right?" "Yes, of course. I saw him groping for a sword, so I went over and hit him again. I was never in the least danger." He looked at her and grinned suddenly. "No, I don't suppose you were in any danger, armed as you were. But I thank you for your intervention. I might have been able to beat all three of them. But then again, I might not." He looked around at the room and grimaced. "I think we'd better find you another room, at least until this one is cleaned up." Chapter 28. In the kingdom of Haladania, in the city of Thrada. The High King Dalim of Haladania frowned as he listened to the news. The Etascans had been defeated and were fleeing from Imcro. The messenger had made it sound like a strategic move, but the plain fact was that the move would not have been necessary if they hadn't suffered a severe defeat. The messenger went on to state that his master, Taltod Imprian Talto, requested an alliance in order to deal with what was clearly a threat to both of them. The High King's frown deepened at that. Most people in such a case would humbly beg his assistance. But of course no representative of the Etascan Empire would humbly beg anything from anyone. It would serve Haltod Imprian Talto right if he were to left him to stew in his own juice. But that thought was discarded almost before it was formed. He had no illusions as to just how loyal his chieftains were. The prospect of someone invading with the thought of removing him would no doubt encourage a lot of them to avoid their duties to their High King. And the Etascans still had a fairly solid little force, which he had held back perhaps a little longer than he ought to have. With that, as well, the force he can mount himself, they ought to be able to deal with whatever little army Dalwyn of Imcro could manage to scrape together. He nodded pleasantly to the messenger. "Does your master require an immediate answer, or are you to be allowed to rest a little?" "If you please, Lord King, I am asked to bring back your response as soon as you are ready." And that, thought Dalum, was cleverly done. Without pointing out the danger to both of us in delaying, he forces me to decide almost on the instant. "Rest yourself, then. I will send for you as soon as may be." No, there was no time to be wasted. He had acted quickly and decisively ever since the death of his father. But even so, if he were seen to be the least bit indecisive, many of those who had fawned over him and flattered him would be sneaking around his back with daggers drawn. He looked around at those gathered. "Bring messengers at once. We must summon all our forces immediately." One of his chieftains looked a little uneasy. "Lord King, do we need to gather our forces? Is the Count likely to attack us? Now that he's driven the Etascans out of his own territory." Dalum frowned at the man. "Corwin Intgulios, use your brain if you have one. Count Dalwyn has no cause to love us, as you well know, and the Etascans are taking refuge in our territory. If you do not use those facts as an excuse to attack us, how safe would we be with the county of Imcro serving as a refuge for every person with a grudge against his chieftain? Best we deal with the situation now, rather than waiting until matters become even more dangerous." He did not mention he was responsible for Dalwyn's dislike and distrust of Haladania. The next thing to do was to plan some sort of campaign against Dalwyn. The Count would undoubtedly be pushing over the border as soon as possible, looking for a battle that he could win in order to draw some of the less loyal Dalin's chieftains to him. That meant the best strategy for the king was one of delaying until he could mass sufficient force to crush the count once and for all. On the other hand, he did not dare to wait too long. That might be seen as indecision, and could drive several waverers into Dalwyn's camp, and depended much on Dalwyn's route as well. There were several chieftains down that way who would grant him free passage through their lands in exchange for a promise that his army would not plunder excessively. He muttered a curse to himself. At this time it would be useful to have the sort of army the Itascans had, so that he could order troops to go down and see to it that those potential traitors either had their backbone stiffened or were removed altogether. He looked around the room, picking out several men. He called their names and led them into a more private room. These were all chieftains whose territory was close enough to Throda that they could be gathered quickly. With something of an army immediately to hand, he would be able to issue orders to his chieftains. He muttered another curse. They might come to him, taking his force around to various chieftains and inviting them politely to help him. He was already going over in his mind some of the chieftains who were further away, and would take all the time they could manage. They would likely show up when all the fighting was done, all full of apologies. "We only just received the message, Lord, and the state of the roads is something dreadful." Well, even if he only took out the men he could gather in 3 days, and added these to the Itascans, there should be enough to deal with Dalwyn. He wondered how the Count had managed to defeat the Imperials. Had he developed some new tricks of strategy, or had he merely been lucky? Now that was a worrisome question. If Dalwyn had developed some new stratagem that could be constantly effective against the Imperials, then the High King might be in desperate trouble. He shook his head. No, there was no sense in worrying about that just yet. When he had had a chance to talk to Haltod and find out just how the Imperials had been defeated, then he could make some definite plans. For now, gather the troops. A day and a half later, he greeted the representative of the Itascan Empire at the gate of Throda. Atalto managed to bring his party in as though they were almost a conquering army, rather than an army fleeing a serious defeat. For one thing, along the way they had met with the last of their troops, which Dalwyn had finally released, too late to take part in the great battle, but in time to provide some sort of status to the representative. And to tell the truth, the High King admitted to himself, even a single thousand imperial spearmen was a force to be reckoned with. With their training and discipline, they were capable of cutting through a whole mob of Haladanians, then wheeling in line to cut their way back through, and that could win the battle. He rode out smiling. "Welcome to my humble city, Lord Atalto. I trust you will consider yourself my guest until this business is taken care of." The Imperial representative smiled in return. "Thank you, High King of Haladania. I appreciate your offer, and will certainly avail myself of your hospitality." He noticed Atalto's eyes on the force of warriors drawn up in front of the city to give him an appropriate greeting. Itascan's expression said nothing, but the High King knew the man was wondering if this was all his force. And of course it wasn't. There were still more coming in every day, and the messengers would not yet have had time to reach the further areas of the kingdom. A good deal depended on how fast Dalwyn was moving. If he lingered in his city for a while, they might just have enough troops to crush him. This was among the first questions he asked of Atalto when they were alone at last. "What have you heard of Dalwyn?" Best not to give him his title. Atalto might be a little sensitive about that. "Has he moved out of the city of Imcro?" "I'm afraid he has. Our scouts say that his own advanced troops have been coming up behind us, though not making any great effort to catch us up. And we've occasionally seen the smoke burning behind us." Dalwyn would have given a lot to know just how extensive that burning was. If Dalwyn was coming into Haladania burning and looting as he came, That would be as good as forcing the chieftains along his line of march to follow the High King. He didn't think the Count of Imcro was that much of a fool, though. For sure, there would be some burning. If a place held too strongly there'd be some burning if a place held too strongly its allegiance to Dalam. But in the main, he suspected that the army of Imcro would be on its best behavior. Might I talk to your scouts myself? You might be insulting Atalto slightly. The risk was worth it. He needed to know as much as possible. Atalto's eyes widened a little. Certainly, if you wish to. They spent only a few minutes on discussing strategy, and then Dalam had Atalto shown to his quarters. It would not do for the High King of Paladania to seem so threatened by the Count of Imcro that he dropped all courtesy to deal with the threat. Chapter 29. Along the road from Imcro to Throta. Dalwyn looked down at the group of men before him, a sub-chieftain and a group of smallholders. They looked a little sullen, probably believing that he was going to steal their flocks and herds, take away their grain, and like as not burn their houses over their heads. He had no intention of doing that, if it could be avoided. His horse took a nervous sideward step, and he patted it once to comfort it. You know me, all of you. I am Count Dalwyn of Imcro, and you know that the High King sold me and my lands to the Ataskan Empire to buy imperial troops to crush his rivals. Ask yourselves whether such a High King would be willing to sell you and your land as well if he thought they're worth the price. As for myself, I ask your help to overthrow this Dalam, who has made himself High King by treachery and underhanded dealing. I promise you this: whether you support me or not, I will not leave you homeless or without food, save only if you take up weapons against me. I only ask of your courtesy, a little food for my army. If you are willing to join us, so much the better. There was doubt still on some of the faces of the men before him. Come now, we haven't all the time in the world to discuss the matter. What do you say? The sub-chieftain shuffled his feet, then looked up. Fine words you talk, Count Dalwyn. But we've seen the smoke and the air to the south of us for days now. Dalwyn kept his expression steady, but underneath it he was annoyed. He had argued just this, that the smoke of burning farms would harden the resolve of no few people who saw it. But his people had been adamant. The folk who insisted on resisting must be destroyed, to send a message to the others. But it appeared the wrong message was being sent. Some insist on fighting for the High King. That is their right, as it is yours. You may want to ask yourselves, though, whether or not it is worth it. And the High King is far away, while you are here at our doorsteps. Is that not so? And if you are beaten, then the High King will come down and punish us for supporting you. But I suppose we ought to keep our steading whole and unburned for as long as possible, oughtn't we? Yes, we will give you what help we can, Lord, so long as you and your army aren't too greedy. We will be as moderate in our demands as we can afford to be. He left some of his subordinates to take charge of gathering the supplies and went back to his army. All in all, their demands were fairly moderate. They had been fortunate hitherto, and many of the sub-chieftains were willing to help rather than see their homes destroyed. They had also been picking up from time to time a few more warriors for the army. A good part of southern Haladania, it seemed, was unhappy with the rule of High King Dalam. Many of these newly joined were a little less willing to follow orders than the men who had followed Dalwyn from Imcro, but they added to his numbers, if nothing else. There was another set of less cheering occurrences. Several sub-chieftains had taken advantage of Dalwyn's invasion to pay off old scores on their neighbors, claiming that the neighbor inveterate supporter of the High King. There's no way right now of investigating these claims or meting out any sort of punishment on such sub-chieftains, particularly since the sub-chieftains always made sure to supply men and food to Dalwyn's host. Wallen was in his usual position behind Dalwyn's shoulder. The old warrior almost reconciled to Halisi's presence. He had to admit Her assistance to Dalwyn against the assassins was not the action of a spy or saboteur. But still and all, she was an Itascan. And that sentiment was the main reason why Dalwyn had decided not to leave Felicity behind in the city of Imcro. It was just too unlikely that some fool might only see an Itascan woman and an enemy. On the other hand, Wallen was definitely not happy with Dalwyn's insistence on using Dalwyn, not Hargadel and his men. Dalwyn had gone through most of his army asking for volunteers. The volunteers would go to Dalwyn and his group and would be trained in the Itascan method of fighting. They had been warned carefully that volunteering thus was no offhand decision to be retracted some time in the future when the person suddenly concluded that he had had enough. Most of the army of Imcro had much the same opinion of Dalwyn as had Wallen, but there were sufficient volunteers to make up a fair force. To a certain extent, Dalwyn's acceptance of Dalwyn and his men meant that many of the rest of the army had accepted them as well, though there were no few who took the same view as Wallen. This meant the occasional fight, but leaders in both groups were always alert, and had so far managed to keep any of the fights from becoming general brawls. As for the volunteers, they took a good deal of jeering at first, but when Dalwyn made a point of watching their drills as frequently as possible, much of the taunting died away, and some even became jealousy. This was tolerated so long as it did not lead to internecine fighting, at which point it was made clear to all that the Count would not condone such conduct. Such matters of discipline were made a little more difficult by the nature of the army of Imcro. It was made up of men under the command of chiefs and sub-chiefs, the greatest number of whom were extremely jealous of their prestige and authority. For another chief, even the Count himself, even the High King himself, to punish or reprimand the other chief's man might lead to the chief taking all his followers and going home in high dudgeon. All these were the difficulties the Count had to deal with in attempting to produce a force that might possibly be the equal of 1,000 Itascan spearmen. Dalwyn looked at Wallen. "We're moving too slowly. Somewhere up there are a force of Itascan spearmen backing up a Paladanian host that is growing daily. We have to reach them and force the battle on them while we still have some chance of winning." Wallen shook his head. "We can't move much faster. We have to pick up the men as well, or we'll come to that fight so badly outnumbered that we may win because the enemy will laugh themselves to death. And that means we must march fast enough to force a fight on Dalwyn before he's ready, but not so fast we ignore the chance of building up our force." Dalwyn grunted in answer. These were all things he knew, but the difficulties worried him. As if he were reading the Count's mind, Wallen said, "Lord, be careful. You can talk like that when it's only me around you that knows you, but be careful what you say in the hearing of others." Dalwyn smiled, nodding. "Yes, I tend to do that a bit much, don't I? Tell me, old friend, what does our force look like so far?" "Fairly good. You've won the allegiance of a lot of young fire-breathers because you beat the Itascans, and they sound like they'd be willing to follow you to the gates of hell. Mind you, a lot of these same folks are unwilling to take anyone's orders, though they may agree to carry out your instructions, in a sort of general way. You've also brought in a fair number of solid men who wanted a good chance to unseat Dalwyn. They'll also follow your orders, in a general way, but some of them have the worst features of the clans and clan chiefs and sub-chiefs. They're proud of their honor and their precedence. If you give an order that seems to impugn their honor, their support for you may well melt away like a summer snowfall." Dalwyn frowned. "All of that I can count on, if I can count on anyone. Are the people from my own county?" "No, it's not so bad as all that. You know how to manage things. You've done it all your life. You can get the best out of most of them. It would be even better if you could convince them to hold back and set some traps on the battlefield the way you did in River back in Imcro. I'm afraid a lot of them would look look on that sort of thing as a reflection on their honor, and you don't have the time to argue them into it the way you had back in Imcro. Yes, I remember that. Even then we lost a few who claimed that this sort of thing wasn't manly and that they must stand up to the enemy and strike you blow for blow until someone was overcome. A few of those have drifted back to you, haven't they? A few, once they realized I'd won the battle, and they'd had a choice of either being left behind or joining to gain glory by helping to win the next. They rode in silence for a while. Then Dalwyn asked, "Have any more of our scouts come back yet? Not since the ones who came in yesterday." It would be good to have some idea of what Dalwyn was doing, and what size of force he's managed to gather so far. Be patient, Lord. They'll come when they come. All Dalwyn could do was nod. In the city of Hartham, on the island of Salsha, the population of the city of Hartham roared through the streets. The siege had been a short one. After 2 weeks, the commander of the Itascan garrison, knowing that no help could come from outside in time, had requested terms. Tulog Dar Ogun granted their terms. He knew that he could have ground them down, eventually destroyed them to the last man, but there would have been a cost, not only to his army, but to the city. And as long as the need was not dire, better to retain his popularity with his people. The Itascans had taken ships and sailed away, taking particularly nothing but their shirts. They stacked their arms and left them. They'd been allowed to carry away with them as personal property nothing but what each man could bear on his back. The gates of the city had been opened, and the tumults had poured in. Being a sensible commander, Tulog had not attempted to prevent his men from celebrating. The only stipulation was that some troops, chosen by whatever means the commander of each unit thought best, would hold off on their celebrating and maintain a guard. It was not entirely impossible that the Itascans might break their own conditions and try to retake the city in the confusion, and Tulog meant to see that did not happen. Gifol hovered around him, trying by subtle means to get his master to join the celebration. He was doomed to disappointment, however. Aside from a mouthful of wine, Tugol was as sober as the lowliest soldier chosen to stay sober and on watch. He knew that the Itascans would not come back, not without careful preparations and a large number of troops, but just in case, he was intending to be ready. "Lord, will you not go into the hall of the Lord of the Protector of the city? He will think something is amiss if you do not join him on his night above all nights." Tulog grimaced. No, there were some things even he could not escape. "Have the Lord Protector informed that I will come to his hall, but only for a short time. I have other duties as well." "Yes, Lord." With a few rapid orders, Gifol had messengers sent off to inform the Lord Protector of the city, and also to inform Tulog's servants that he would be coming to make ready. When that was done, Tulog spoke. "Gifol?" "Yes, Lord." "I will go to the hall of the Protector, but I will not go dressed like some pretty boy of the cities. If it frightens the Lord Protector to see me come in armor with my sword at my side, then he must be frightened. Yes, I will wash and make myself clean, but you can press me only so far, Gifol. The Empire of Tumulia is entering a time when her people must be prepared to fight to keep themselves from falling to the Itascans, the Queosach, or some nation we do not yet know. I must be an example for them." "Yes, Lord." Gifol was subdued, but only a little. Wian Dar Othan, Lord Protector of the city, was a stolid little man, descended of a family of weavers, it was said, who had been Lord Protector of the city of Harhom at the time when the Itascans had taken over, and stayed in the position during the Itascan occupation. In the last few months, the Itascan authorities had been undercutting his position, circumventing his authority by putting their own authorities to give and withhold permission for practically anything a person might want to do. He'd been a part of the underground resistance movement, but he'd been maintaining his position carefully so as to avoid giving the Itascan authorities any excuse for removing him. Now that the city was once again under the Tumulian Empire, he was ready to take up his position once more. His position, of course, was at the disposal of the Emperor, and if the Emperor decided he ought to not be Lord Protector for whatever reason, then he would not be Lord Protector. But Wian Dar Othan showed no sign of being aware of those facts. Given his life and his experiences, he would not. And as far as Tulog was concerned, there seemed every reason to leave him in his position, and no reason to remove him. Wian bowed low. "Welcome, Highness! Welcome, and 3 times welcome, since you have driven the foreigners out." "Thank you, Lord Protector." Did the man just relax a little on thus being addressed? It was impossible to say. "I can only join you for a short while, since it is necessary to make sure that the foreigners don't sneak back in while we're not looking. But I assure you that when the situation is finally made sure, I will myself hold a celebration to which all loyal tumults will be invited." He spent a few minutes at the Lord Protector's hall, drank a cup of wine, then went back out. Yes, the city of Hawthorne was celebrating, and much of the island of Salsha was celebrating, but he was not deluding himself that the war was done. As soon as the Atascans could gather a new army, they would be back. On his part, Tulug was doing his best to be ready for them. The change in troop formations had worked fairly well in practice, and even with the comparatively little time they had to prepare themselves, one of the main unforeseen problems had been the rivalries between various contingents. It seemed that some of them were barely less dislike of each other than they had of the Atascans. This meant that many men were loath to give up their traditional methods of fighting to take on the style of people they disliked. The promise of better rations and quarters drew some volunteers, eventually enough to fill out the initial force he had desired. The fact that they had proven themselves in battle now allowed him to press for the continuation and expansion of the project. He would see to it that each of the men in the ranks of this force was rewarded with a silver piece, and each officer a gold piece. This would help draw more volunteers. And as for the Queosach, well, the situation was less than clear. His agents had spread a lot of money around to keep things stirred up as much as possible. A couple men who had no real chance of becoming king had given enough money to buy a little support of their own, so that more likely candidates would have to go a little more trouble. There was a rumor that a war was in the making up there, a 3-way war, so with any luck, they would not find another Telwathiat Othfigure to unite them anytime soon. May the gods grant that there would be time enough for him to fight the Atascans to a standstill. Chapter 31. Evening on a battlefield, south of Throdet. The 2 armies began their fight in late afternoon, and had striven through the day, with neither able to gain any advantage. The spearmen trained in the Atascan fashion had proved their worth, facing the Atascan professionals and holding them in line through the day, while the Haladanians shouted and charged and swung their swords on both flanks. When dusk fell, both sides pulled back, by some mutual consent, and rested. Neither side trusted the other enough to break ranks, but they made shift to have some set bringing up food, then lots to see who would take the first watch and who would sleep. Dalwyn's men had set up a tent for him behind the lines, with the effort prevailed on him to go there and rest. "Lord, have some sense," declared Wallen. "The battle will continue tomorrow, and what good will you be to us if you wear yourself out tonight? Go, rest, and if anything untoward happens, we'll be sure to call you." Still a little reluctantly he retired to the tent. Hallisey was within, preparing food. She gave him a quick smile, and went back to her work. By the time he had managed to have a bit of a wash, she had set up a bowl of soup before him. Then, still without saying anything, she went back to sit on the mattress across the room. He had managed to give her a smile in return, feeling grateful she did not try to involve him in conversation. He was still thinking about the reports that had come in from the troops regarding the day's fight. There were some troops which had taken severe casualties and would not be fit for too much fighting tomorrow. They had done well against Dallam, all told, and the High King would have suffered severely himself. But Dallam, as reports were suggesting, was gaining more troops overnight, sub-chieftains who had been late in answering his summons. Truth to tell, there were a few coming in for the army of Imgro as well, but much fewer. Choices. There were only 2 choices, neither of which looked particularly good. One choice was to renew the fight tomorrow morning, with the hope with the hope that some chance of battle might allow them to win, even lengthening odds. The second choice was to withdraw and to attempt to build up forces for another try. Even if they could pull away from the enemy without retreat becoming a complete row, they had some small chance of being able to gather a new and stronger force before Dalum ascended on them with his. He finished his soup and then looked at Halisi. "Thank you for the food, and for your consideration. I'm in no fit shape for human company tonight." "Don't worry about me. I expect nothing from you tonight. I will stay here and stay quiet in case you need me. But you need not feel that I have to be entertained." He nodded. He went over to the mattress and lay down, closing his eyes. He thought about taking off his armor to allow him to sleep, and tried to urge himself to get up. He remembered taking off his armor, but when he awoke suddenly a little while later, he was still wearing it. Halisi was down at the end of the mattress, reclining against one of the tent supports, sound asleep. He pulled himself to his feet and took off his armor. If there was an alarm, he might have to go out without it, but it would be better if he could get some proper rest. He wished a tree would fall on the High King overnight, removing the need for tomorrow's battle. He would perhaps eat something bad and die of it before morning. Perhaps a rabid badger would sneak into his camp and bite his toe. Perhaps something of the gods of weather might cause such a heavy rain that his tent that he would drown of it. And all that nonsense, he smiled grimly to himself. His hand brushed the Wolf Talisman on his chest. No, he could not take the wolf's shape or go off running through the forest. The Makar healers had warned him of that. Though he was cured of the serious side effects of his long spell with the talisman, there's no saying what might happen if he used it again, at least for a long while. He might perhaps be trapped again, and this time it would be much more difficult to bring him out of it. Not to mention the fact that there might be an alarm while he was out running, and what would his people do if they came to warn him and could not find him? Unless, of course, he was to creep into Dalum's camp and bite out his throat, as he had done to the king of the Queosach. Another foolish notion. He paused. Or was it actually a foolish notion? Could he possibly creep around the camps, find Dalum, and kill him? If he could, it would solve his great difficulty for him, would it not? There was a problem of how it would look to the people, particularly the ones who were caught up in the notions of honor and dishonor. Rather, he should leave them to battle in the morning, hoping against all hope that something would happen to allow them to win the victory. He went out of the tent. He stepped out of the tent. There were guards around his tent, but out of some sort of consideration, they had moved off a little to the distance. He wondered, had they really thought that he would be falling into bed with Halisi while men lay out in the field, dead in his cause? The sentry looked up as he approached. "No trouble, lad. I just feel the need of a little exercise." "Yes, lord." He walked off a little ways, then looked around. No one was in sight, and he put a large willow between himself and the sentry. He took a deep breath and took on the wolf shape. It was easier than he had expected at first. In the starlight he glided between the trees and bushes quietly, alert to men well before they could notice his presence. Even around the edge of the enemy force, a few of the sentries seemed to be watching for anything as low as to the ground as a wolf. He kept himself hidden as much as possible, slipping from hummock to hummock, from bush to bush. This far back from the front line, the people seemed to be less wary, though perhaps he ought to go back and lead a small raid around the rear. No, he could slip this far in wolf guise, using all the prowess of the wolf. A body of men would make too much noise to go unnoticed. And besides, he was almost at his goal. Just over there was the tent that carried the High King's banner, hanging limply out its pole in the calm of the night. In addition, it was well guarded. Men from several clans had been chosen for the honor, quite likely on the grounds that if no major clan was left out, none of them would feel their honor was slighted. they seemed to be fairly alert as well. The alertness was most often directed toward their neighbors, as though in hopes of catching the neighbor nodding off at his post, or making sure that no one trespassed into the area which another was set to guard. He almost gave it up then, but decided he could manage, using bits of cover that were present. It just might be possible if he made his moves at the right times. It took a good deal of time and patience, but he was finally at a place almost midway between two sentries. Judging his time carefully, he slipped out a fold in the ground and moved toward a bush. There was a wordless shout as one sentry drew his spear, then came rushing over, drawing his sword. The spear passed well over Dalwyn's back, coming near to this next sentry, just on the other side of the low bush. The fellow, seeing only the spear striking beside his leg, and the other sentry charging with sword in hand, drew his own spear, and with more accuracy, striking the man in the chest. With a cry, that one went down. What with the two shouts and the noise, the sentries and other people who happened to be awake came running over. One looked down at the man with the spear in his chest, and the other sentry, standing there with his own ox out now, shouted, "Treason!" The sentry who had speared his fellow sentry shouted. The treason was on his side. He'd thrown a spear at me and was coming at me with a sword in hand. See, here's his spear. But someone else, one of the clans, more friendly to the dead man, shouted, "The Nat Wildens are murdering us!" and threw his own spear, with fair accuracy, so that the other sentry went down with a spear in his shoulder. By this time there was quite a crowd of various people, and someone closer allied to Nat Willian sentry drew his sword and attacked the man who had speared him. This began as a general melee of warriors, various clans, each with rivalries and allies among the others. So it was difficult to tell who was a friend and who was foe, particularly in the indifferent light of the stars. And by this time, men who had been resting out of the lines came running to see what was happening, and many began to join in, seeing friends or family being attacked. Dalwyn muttered a curse to himself. There was no point in trying to slip into the king's tent now, not with this crowd around outside of it. He ran off the way he'd come, an easier trip now that most of the camp was in an uproar around Dalwyn's tent. As he rushed around the edges of the camp toward his own army, he cursed again. What with the uproar over here, people would be looking for him to tell him about it. They would probably think this was preparation for an attack, and if they couldn't find him, they'd be worried about it. He saw one of the sentries of his own army slip behind a tree and changed his shape again. It was a strain. For a moment he remembered the warnings of the Bakar healers. Then he was a man again. He stepped from behind the tree and calling to the sentry. The man saw him and took up a guard position, advancing the point of his spear. "It's only me, Count Dalwyn. Let me come closer so you can see me." "Come in carefully now." The man was scanning the bush behind Dalwyn, looking for a force of enemies ready to charge out. He turned his head back over his shoulder and called out, "Ho! Over here!" Dalwyn muttered a curse again. He had hoped to slip into the camp again with no fuss, but there was no faulting the sentry. He was only doing what he ought to do, what with the uproar sounding across the field. By now, he was close enough for the man to recognize him, and the sentry lowered his spear. "Lord Dalwyn? Your pardon, Lord, You're only doing the job you are set to do. I was a fool going out of the camp and falling asleep when the noise awoke me. I had come rushing back to see what might be happening. There was no way to explain right now that he had been the cause of the uproar, but let that be." By this time, a small group of men had come over to see what was happening, and seeing the court, they stopped in surprise. I'm going to my tent to put on my armor. One of you come with me. Someone else go with Wallen and let him know where I am." The quick issuing of orders forestalled any questions anyone might ask, and once he had asserted his authority, it would be a bold man who would have the temerity to ask questions. In fact, they met Wallen at the tent, in a mild state of worry. fact that Halisi had been asleep in the tent reassured him only slightly. That meant it was unlikely anyone had managed to snatch him from his tent, but where was he? He rapidly gave out a story about going out of the camp and falling asleep, then declared he was going to put on his armor. Wallen looked at him strangely, and then told what he knew about the fuss across the field. Just a little while ago, some sort of ruckus broke out over there. It doesn't seem to be attack, but we can't tell just what it is. Our people are on alert, just in case. Dalwyn nodded briefly. He could hear that the noise was still continuing. Had Dalwyn been unable to break up the melee? All the better. He got into his armor as quickly as possible. He considered what he might do. Should he order an attack right now, while trouble was still going on? No. There's no telling just how long the fight might go on. And if Dalwyn was able to get his men into shape soon, the result might not be too favorable to the army of Imcro. If he could just trust his ears, the noise over there was getting more, not less. Did that mean the fight was spreading? Had Dalwyn perhaps caught a chance spear or sword gut and been put down? Had the matter gotten so far out of hand that even Dalwyn was not able to put it to rights? He could well imagine something similar happening to his own army. There were parts of his force which he did not dare have next to each other in line, or even biovac next to each other, for fear of strife. There had been more than one time in the march when that rival clans that happened to come together, resulting in more than a few deaths. But all his cases had happened in broad daylight, and he had been able to get them separated by interposing himself along with a small force of trusted men. What might happen if something happened at night on a field where a grievous battle had just been fought? There would be some engaged in the fight because they thought some of the men of Imcro had crept up to hit them from behind, and in dim light, Dalwyn might have greater trouble getting enough neutral men together to part the fighters. He wished he could assure Wallen just as to what the final reason for the disturbance, but that would not do. It would only confuse Wallen. They all needed clear heads at this point. If someone over there decided that they were under attack and must attack against the men of Imcro, there might be a night battle, whether they wanted it or not. They hurried to the battle line as quickly as they could without giving the appearance of panic, and looked out into the dimness, seeking some sign of what was happening. There was no mistaking the sound of fighting now. It was dying down a little. It was still possible that someone over there might take it into his head to order an attack, and so he had the men to stand to, and he stood with them. Another hour. The noise ended. Dalwyn or someone over there had finally asserted authority. Even then, Dalwyn wondered what might be the effect on the morale of the men. Many of them would know nothing but the fact that there had been fighting and disturbance around the High King's tent. Rumors would undoubtedly inflate what really had happened, and it was likely that Dalwyn would have to spend much of the night walking among his troops to reassure them he was still alive. "I'll wager that some of his people are fighting among themselves," said Wallen. "I've heard no less than double that with the sort of thing we've had. I guess you're right." "Not really, old comrade. I know you're right, but I can't tell you that." Dawn came. For a while, they could only strain to see what was the situation over there, when Wallen spoke. "By all the gods and spirits, they're missing a whole lot of their army. See, the Nat Willian standard is missing, and the Oatlords, Intcath slots, and more. Whatever happened to that disturbance last night, it must have made several of them pull out." Dalwyn rubbed his chin. "Yes, if there was serious fighting among them, some of the clans would have refused to fight again as long as the rivals were present. And some may simply have been frightened into flight by the sounds of fighting within their camp. What do you think? Perhaps we are a bit better matched than we were yesterday?" "I think we might be. And if we attack as soon as we get our men to move, I think we may even have a better chance." He turned and began to issue rapid orders. Chapter 32. In Thrata. I can already tell you right now, this is the last chapter, and this is only one page. This is not enough. So, there will be more bulking of this. What I'll probably do is, once I'm done, anyway, I'm going to finish reading this. In Thrata, in the hall of the High King. It had not been possible for the new High King to leave the hall any sooner than this, for fear of insulting some chieftain. But eventually he made his way to his bedchamber, a little fuzzy with ale, but still steady on his feet. The battle 4 days ago had begun as a bitter struggle, but many of Dalwyn's men did not have their full hearts in the struggle. They could see just as well as any that several of their standards were missing, and they heard the fuss the previous night. The rumors had been going the rounds. For a time, Dalwyn thought they might have misjudged the temper of the High King's army. Then some of them began to force back a step, then two, then another two. Suddenly they were fleeing, and that began the debacle, a running fight that lasted the rest of that day. Somewhere in the middle of the day, a group of triumphant clansmen brought in Dalum's head. After that, there was only a little fighting, and chieftains who only that morning had been loyal servants to the High King of Dalum came forward to offer their full support to the new High King, Dalwyn of Imcro. He had asked during the day about the fate and whereabouts of Halisi's father, and eventually been told that the remnants of the Ataskan army were seeking a truce. The commander did the negotiations, speaking on behalf of Atalto, who remained back among the soldiers, attempting to maintain whatever aloof dignity he could manage. Dalwyn had had enough and more than enough of slaughter, and was quite happy to grant the Ataskans safe passage out of Aladania. He considered forcing them to disarm, but he realized they would never survive to the border without arms, so he allowed them to march out with arms and armor intact, and a token of a few thousand gold pieces. He wondered if Atalto would insist on his daughter's return, and wondered, too, what he would do if Atalto did insist. But it seemed that the Ataskan representative was quite willing to forget that he even had a daughter. So now Dalwyn was High King, though there were some mutterings from some who felt they might have a better claim. But on the whole, his reign was secure enough, and that would be until such time as the Ataskans were finished their war with the Tumults. If he could manage it, at that time, he would have a force trained and ready to fight them. He opened the bedroom door and walked in. Halisi sitting on a chair, apparently waiting for him. "I'm sorry," he told her, "but I did warn you that I wouldn't be able to get away from this banquet until late." "I know," she smiled. "I know. I decided to wait for you anyway. I'm afraid it's going to be a little while before the people in general accept that an Ataskan is the wife of their High King." He grimaced. "I'm afraid you're right there." "Well, when they see that I'm not about to get rid of you, most of them will come around." She was silent for a little. Then she asked, "Dalwyn, where did you go that night of the battle? I woke at one point and you were gone, but your armor was still there. Then I woke up and Wallen was there in the tent looking for you, and you didn't get back for some time. What happened?" It was a question no one else had asked. The battle had been won, Dalwyn killed, and the Ataskans driven out, so nothing serious had come of Dalwyn's being unavailable during an important point in the night. He bit his lip, then answered, "I used my talisman, then went round to sneak into Dalwyn's camp, hoping to kill him and end the war. A sentry saw me and threw a spear. Another sentry thought the spear had been aimed at him, and threw another spear at the first one. Before you knew it, there was a general melee going on. I slipped out of there and came back to our own lines. But even so, I was not back before people were looking for me. It was a foolish move of mine, when I think about it in the daylight. But at the time, it was all I could think to do." Okay, so that was the last part of that. Like I said, this is super rough. I can tell it's super rough because it's also very, very short. What I'm probably going to do is, not right now, I have other things I'm going to be working on, but once I get caught up on projects, I will probably start building it out a bit. Once I've built out the story a bit more, I will probably retell it to you. It won't be for a little while, so you aren't going to hear it right away. That's going to take some time. But it's a story I will circle back to once I've had it. Once you have the before, and then you'll get the after. But anyway, like I was saying, I'm going to go off on a bit of a hiatus. And when I get back, I will be back with a new story for you. So until then, take care and have a good time. Good night.